Hi everybody, in the last video I was talking about my server rack, and I thought today would be a good day to give you a tour of this. I just added my Cisco CCNA lab to the rack here a few days ago and rearranged a few things. So let me give you a tour of the rack from the top to the bottom. First off, this rack is a Winstead brand, which you see up there. This is a 45U full height rack with side panels and a front and rear door. The front door is got a big plexiglass window and a lock, which is awful nice, considering that this room is in my basement where my kids also have access, and it's nice to keep the equipment somewhat dust free in the basement. Though this is a finished spot, it's not completely dust free. At the very top of the rack you'll see my patch panel. This is a Cat 5e patch panel that feeds 9 jacks spread across my house and my office and in a couple other places. Below that is a 24 port gigabit switch. That switch happens to be made by a company called Ammer. It's an okay switch. It's a web smart switch, so it has some VLAN capability and whatnot. I'm not using that currently, but it's there. And I have some things patched in from my house in there, and also the servers that are in the rack. And below that is my current router. You may have seen my other video on pfSense, my $200 pfSense router. I have since replaced it with this 1U unit because it fits more neatly in my rack. I originally had the small form factor case that I had my other router in on a shelf in here, but I prefer the 1U rack mount. This is a Supermicro 1U Atom powered server. I believe it has an Atom D525 in it. Dual gigabit Ethernet interfaces, which you can see status lights on the front. And this is a nice little server. I believe it has 4 gigs of RAM in it currently, and actually I'm running this on a hard drive, whereas I was running the other router off of a flash USB flash drive. The reason I did that was I wanted to experiment with some of the modules that are only available for the full install pfSense. And that is fed by my 15 megabit DSL connection. Not extremely fast, but gets the job done here, and it's the best we can do here. Moving down the rack, you start to see the equipment that I talked about in my Cisco video that I recently put up. These are the C2960, the 2960 Cisco 48 port 10100 switches with dual gigabit uplinks. You see I've got them labeled there. Below those I have the two C3560s, Cisco 3560 switches. The top switch is just a regular switch. The bottom there you see I have a couple of gigabit modules in the expansion ports, and it's also, as you can see there, it's a power over Ethernet switch. I do have one power over Ethernet device in the house currently. That's my Cisco wireless access point, but that's actually powered by a remote gigabit PoE injector, which is tucked away in the back of this rack. Below that I have the 3 routers that make up the routing portion of my CCNA lab. These are C2811s, and I have them mounted backwards so that I can access the network ports on the back and the modules. These sag a fair bit in the rack, and I'm not exactly sure why. I think it just has to do with the design of the ears that Cisco used on these things. But I did manage to get them in the rack in a somewhat clean way. And below that is the access server, the Cisco 2509. Now the console ports of the 7 devices above it are all connected into the access server, and I can telnet into the access server, or through the access server rather, to the consoles of any of these devices. I also have these on a separate power supply from the rest of the rack, which I'll talk about in a minute. Below the Cisco rack I have a small monitor KVM setup stuck in here. What I'd really like to have is a remote monitor in a pull-out drawer, but those console monitors are a little bit pricey for what you get, in my opinion. I've been waiting for a good deal to come by. But I just got a keyboard and a 4-port KVM and a 15-inch monitor. You can see the display for my Freenas server currently is up, which we'll talk about in a second. Below that you'll see the one of the servers that I have in the rack. This is a HP DL380 G5. It has dual Xeon E5450s in it and a 32 gigabytes of RAM. This was actually something I picked up for free from a tech recycler, believe it or not. It had several drives in it. It wasn't completely populated. This currently has 8 72 gigabyte rather 15,000 RPM SAS drives in it, and it had like 8 gigs of RAM when I got it, and I off of eBay got 32 gigs set for it, and it had a bad power supply. Luckily it's dual redundant supplies, but I happened to source another supply from a server that we had at work that was being decommissioned. So this is fully functional at this point. You can see it's not on. One, it consumes a lot of electricity, so I only use it when I am working with it, and two, it's fairly loud, so it wouldn't be good for the recording the video. Right now it has Citrix End Server 6.5 installed on it, and I use it primarily for experimenting with some VMs, mostly Linux distros, and it works quite well for that. It's got plenty of horsepower and a fair bit of RAM for doing that. Now below that I have a tower mount computer. This is my Freenas box. It's a 3 gigahertz Xeon 3370, excuse me, X3370, 3 gigahertz with 8 gigs of RAM, running on a Supermicro motherboard, 8 gigs of ECC RAM. It's been a great little machine for that. It's for Freenas. It has 4 3 terabyte Western Digital Red drives in it, which have been great as well. They're in RAID Z2 at the moment, which is not as fast as say RAID 10, but I like the idea of RAID Z2 better than RAID 10, and besides this will saturate the gigabit link that it has to the rest of my network anyway with RAID Z2, so I don't really worry about it. Off to the side you see there's some additional drives for the DL380, and I actually have a lot of drives for that, because I also, when I got the DL380, I got a 25 slot 2U remote storage box for this thing. I don't have rails for that currently, so it's not in the rack, but there's a few of the drives that I have for putting in the DL380 should I need them. And below that, at the very bottom of the rack, I have power supplies that are for the DL380, and also a battery backup. Now the battery backup currently is only hooked to the Freenas server. Freenas server also runs 2 virtual machines on it. It runs my Plex server, which is stored on the Freenas and is served from the Plex, and also it runs a transmission server for me to download ISOs and the like. So it's nice to have a BitTorrent server that you can just fire off downloads on and leave them unattended. So this rack is actually quite deep. It's kind of hard to tell from the front, but if I go around to the side, you'll see it's quite deep. This is actually a 38-inch deep rack, which hasn't actually, there's some glare from the lights there, but as you can see, it's very close to the ceiling down here in my basement. The rack stands about 7 feet high. The ceilings down here are about 7 feet 3 inches high. So when I brought this rack down into the basement, it just cleared the ceiling when I stood it up. And you can see also the floor in here has got foam on the floor. This is kind of a playroom for my kids as well. What I've done is remove the foam from underneath the rack, and it's hard to tell in the video, but I recently put this on casters. The bottom 3 inches are actually a pedestal that accepts 2.5 inch casters. So this entire rack can be rolled away from the wall where it currently sits, so I can get at the back of the rack, which is awful nice. And I strongly suggest, if you're going to have a rack, especially a heavy one, that you get one that you can put wheels on, because it makes moving around so much easier. So anyway, that's the current state of the rack in here. Oh, one more thing I wanted to show you. You notice none of the Cisco equipment was on. You see this kind of funny power strip sitting here on the side. There's a switch right here. If I fire off the switch, you hear some of the Cisco equipment come up. I have my lab wired into a remote switch there, so I can have the lab on when I'm using it. And as you can see there, the switches are coming up. So anyway, that's my basement rack, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.